In Season 2 of the Nested Healing Podcast, From Surviving to Thriving, we will take you with us on our journey to the many nourishing lands of healing. With a new guest for each episode, we will get to embark on each of their healing journeys, with their curiosity being, what challenges did they face, and just how did they manage to come up on the other side? From self-love and acceptance, all the way to dance and movement, we will explore the myriad of healing components shining in each of our guests' stories. How can we relate and apply this to our own lives? How can we brighten our light through a dark tunnel? Stay with us on our beautiful deep dive into healing.
Welcome to the Nested Healing Podcast. I'm your host, Jen, and I'm here with Ken today. I'm really looking forward to hearing about your journey of healing. And I'm curious, where would you like to start this story today, Ken?
Well, thank you, and thank you for the invitation to have this conversation with you. Where would I like to start? I think one thing I'd like to share with your listeners is anytime I attempt to talk about things like this, we could say things that are significant or can be very significant for some of us, something in me gets afraid. And one way that I'm able to show up, even though that something is afraid, is I have come to recognize or believe for myself that whatever we say in our conversation, whatever I say in terms of how I've made sense of this, is no more or less significant than an oriole song in the spring, or the sound of the wind through the leaves in a stand of quaking aspens, or the sounds of a sea lion barking in a pod in San Francisco Bay. I've come to recognize that life is always calling to life. There's like a call and response that's happening. And so I would just invite your listeners to hear whatever resonates for them and to recognize it as just some emanation that's happening in this exchange. It doesn't need to have any sort of, I'll call it, lasting significance or meaning.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Thanks for sharing. Some of the things I really hear in there is the sort of spontaneous expression of just what's here in the moment, and also a real sense of belonging with everything.
Yes. Yes.
Is that something in and of itself that's been really prominent for you in your own sort of journey towards healing?
Yes, I think there's so many things that we could talk about, and hopefully a number of things will emerge. But for me, yes, I think what's shifted for me over the now more than 40 years that I've been consciously moving toward something that feels more life affirming, is that the natural potential of the source of life itself is always at work on our behalf.
Mm.
And so if I were to condense much of what I've learned into some simple way of understanding, it's that there's always so much that's happening that anything we could say about it can only be a very tiny fraction of what's actually happening. And I think we've been conditioned to pay attention more to our own inner narrative or someone else's narrative. And it isn't so much that there's a problem with that, except that we're missing so much more that's also true. So yes, I would say in terms of inspiration or healing or jump starting some sort of natural unfolding, hearing the sound of a sea lion bark while I'm hiking out on a coast is probably one of the most impactful experiences I've ever had. Or noticing the flavor and the texture of a raw pecan. These things can be just as impactful as reading some very sophisticated and quite useful treatise on trauma or healing. So for me, I think what's helped me more than anything is settling into and resting into the recognition that our organism, our system, is always working on our behalf, no matter what we're hearing, no matter what we're feeling, that life itself is unfolding as it does.
Hmm. I wonder, Ken, if you could share maybe an example of kind of how or when you first noticed a glimmer of that insight.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I'll just say a little bit about my background so that it hopefully people can get a sense of maybe whether this is relevant to them or not. But I came from a very violent family. So I grew up in a small town in Texas. Both of my parents were very young when they married. Both of them were from alcoholic families, and both of them were just not well developed. They had experienced a lot of abuse themselves. So my childhood was a very abusive environment. And I'm also a very sensitive person. That's a tough combination. And so some of my earliest memories, probably 6, 7 years old, I would escape from the house and go out. We lived on the edge of a small town, and there was a big cow pasture behind us, and we had a tree in the backyard that was big enough that I could climb up into it. And so I would spend hours, it seemed like hours, as I recall. I would climb up in this tree and with the leaves on, it was difficult to see me. So unless you were looking for me, you wouldn't necessarily see me. And I would just sit up there for hours and just watch the world as it was doing its thing, listening and smelling. And oftentimes birds would come and sit in the tree with me, just, a few feet away. And I remember experiencing those moments. And even as I'm thinking about it, I can remember the taste of the tears from running down my face and touching my lips. There was solace there in the breeze, in the sounds, in the obscurity of not being seen, not being targeted, not being focused on. And even though my world felt, and our home in particular, felt so chaotic and so unsafe, somehow just recognizing more of what was true, I found some sense of well-being, some sense of possibility, some sense of, I would say, a longing that was recognized to continue.
Hmm. Thanks for
And then
sharing
many
that.
instances since, many instances
Mhm.
since. Yeah.
Yeah. I can just picture that as you're saying as a young boy, 6 or 7, sitting in this tree, being sort of held and protected by this tree. There's that felt sense of that comes up for me as you share, joined by the
Yeah.
birds in the tree. And this is like you're saying, it's before you had studied any particular path about healing or spirituality or anything like that. That was something that you found some natural access to.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I would say now, after having explored and studied and received much support from many different, very talented people, it really comes down to me for suffering and pain are not the same. And the extent to which I have suffered and continue to suffer, I have come to recognize it's primarily around fixation and constriction. So that's an early example of when we can pick our head up and just notice more of what's happening, what's naturally already happening. Somehow there's more space for whatever emotions we're feeling, whatever physical sensations we're feeling. There's more space and there's more of a natural sense of, as you said, being part of something much larger than ourselves. And I still find great comfort in that recognition.
I wonder if you could share for our listeners a little bit more about what fixation means, as you mentioned a moment ago.
Yeah, for me, and that term, I probably came across that term in some of the Buddhist and Taoist traditions. It's like it's like when something captures our attention or our focus can be almost laser focused on something. It can be a thought, it can be something someone said. My mind tends to be very active, and as far back as I can remember, it's this way. In my early adulthood, I would start to hear certain things, oftentimes judgmental, and it would be like I would call it a mind spin, but it was almost like it was going to cause a blackout in the electrical grid around me because it was just pulling so much energy, so much, and oftentimes they were very harmful or judgmental thoughts, which then I would feel as constriction in my body and pain, and oftentimes it could take me days to have that release. Like once I would get caught in one of those cycles, it was like a self-reinforcing cycle. I would just fixate on it. And I wasn't doing it consciously, but my attention would get captured. And then my world is very small. My capacity to be available to other things, to even notice more of what was true, was limited. Um, I think it's useful to acknowledge from my standpoint that early on, I thought all of this was happening in my mind, kind of in that early stage of my own adult awakening. It was, I kind of felt like my body was just a not so effective method for my mind to move around. And I was almost wholly identified with my thoughts, trying to discount emotions and physical sensations. But now I recognize that they're so integral, so much related, that as my mind contracted or constricted, my body would follow and the emotions would follow, and then my ability to interact would be constrained. So the difference for me is, um, and this, when we talk about healing or recovering from trauma, for me, the best indication of whether I'm moving in a direction that's life affirming is, do I have more capacity, more range, more elasticity to be present and respond and participate with what's unfolding? In those early days, what I would call fixation or constriction is I had very limited capacity to be any different than I was in that experience, no matter what else was happening.
Mm, absolutely. So I'm definitely getting a sense of I can even feel how you mentioned the emotions and the sensations follow the thought patterns, right? How that constriction, and then it limits how you can interact, get a real good sense of that. And then you'd also just mentioned how you can tell if you're moving towards something life affirming, having a little more space and elasticity. I wonder if you could describe how that feels a little bit deeper. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of my suffering, and for the clients whom I've worked with, I think it's fair to say that most of my suffering has arisen from a case of misunderstanding. Sometimes I would say it's a case of mistaken identity, that I've come to know myself in a much smaller way than is true, but it can be misunderstandings in many different ways. Early on, I had this impression, and I think it was conditioned into me, but I had this impression that my life was a problem to be solved. And I had this feeling of desperation that I didn't know how to solve it, but if I didn't solve it and I didn't solve it soon, that there was going to be an eternal price to pay. And so I kind of was always, I would wake up with this experience of almost desperation that I had to figure it all out. As I started to find different ways of experiencing my life, and primarily through contact with people, experiencing different kinds of contact and different kinds of relationship, I've come to recognize and view my life more as a game we played as a child, where we called it getting warmer, getting colder. Someone would pick an object. If you're in a room or outside, they'd pick an object, and then everyone else would start moving, and the host of the game would say, "You're getting warmer, you're getting colder, you're getting hot, you're getting icy." There's this sense of we're moving towards the goal. We're moving towards what we're trying to accomplish. I've come to recognize that our life is that way, that so much of how we find what's life affirming for us is a felt sense. It's an integrated way of recognizing beyond our thinking, or at least inclusive of our thinking, but so much more than our thinking. So I also also recognized as I started to play that game or consciously use that game as a way of understanding my life, I remembered back when I would play with my sisters, one of my sisters in particular was an unreliable host. She would pick an object and you'd start moving towards it and you thought you were getting close and then she would change it but wouldn't tell you. I felt like there were aspects of me that would do that all the time. Like I would feel like I was moving towards something that was warmer, more life affirming, and then all of a sudden it was gone, or I would start to feel colder. So it's like, how can you play the game if you can't trust the host? It's not fun, it's frustrating. So at a different level, what I've come to recognize is the way I can tell if I'm moving in a life affirming direction is that I don't get stuck on anything. So I might move towards something that is genuinely life affirming, but fear arises, constriction arises, other things come that might feel very like, oh, that's bad, move away from it. But if it doesn't get stuck, if I can notice that whatever's arising can kind of run its course, then over time I can get a better sense of whether the direction I'm walking, moving, conversing is in fact life affirming. So this experience of elasticity, fluidity, it isn't so much always open, always closed. It's this capacity to respond appropriately to whatever's unfolding.
Mm, that's so helpful. Thanks for explaining that with such an illustrative example.
Hmm.
I'm also curious if you could talk a little bit about maybe how this feels. So you mentioned, sometimes things can still arise, fear can still arise, but can it pass? Can it run its course?
Mhm.
And that's something that I think has been, at least I've noticed this in my own trauma healing journey and in many others. Something that can be difficult initially is to know that any feeling could move and run its course, like because we're so used to, I think, before being on this path, maybe everything feeling stuck. Like you mentioned, there was a lot of fixation in the beginning, right?
Yeah.
What would be maybe a sort of I'd say either a really beginning level story that you could remember back from when you were newer on your path, or something you
Yeah.
might tell somebody new at this about um, even being able to be with a feeling or allow it to run its course. How would you start with that for someone
Again, I
new?
think there's so many things we could say, but I would say one thing that comes to mind that I've learned that I think is really helpful and important to hear is that I've come to recognize and believe that all of us are always doing the best that we can with what we have access to in the moment. Some of my early misunderstanding was that I had this notion that if I was having a hard time, if I wanted to be more open, but I found myself closed, if I wanted to be happy, but I felt really scared, that I was doing something wrong, and that if I just tried harder, that it would be better. I've come to recognize I don't think that's even remotely true. I think we're always doing the best that we can with what we have access to in the moment. And as human beings, as biological organisms, I think it's helpful to recognize that we have evolved to need certain things. Some of the things I highlight on is we need connection. We need connection. And if we have adequate connection, then we will naturally explore. And as we explore, our system will adapt. I think I mentioned to you before, I have young grandchildren. They're now almost 3 years old, and I've had the good fortune of being their twins, to be with them since they've been babies. And I've really appreciated witnessing what it's like in the early formation of these young human beings. But back to your question, in the early days, I think most of us, when we have had the experience of having to contract, to hold back emotions that would have been overwhelming for us when we were younger, there's a reasonable and understandable fear that if we open enough for those emotions to move, that we'll somehow be harmed, that we'll be overwhelmed, that we'll be crying and not be able to stop, that we'll like break somehow. That's how I experienced it. What made it possible to start to have the experience of these things move is to find people who I felt seen and understood and heard, safe with. I think that's what made it possible for me to start to experience these intense emotions that had been held back for so long And also I want to make it clear, it wasn't like I found one or two people and then, I had 10 sessions and then everything's better. This has been a lifelong journey for me. But I think it would not have been possible if I hadn't made contact with some people where I felt seen, understood, cared for, and safe. That connection, I think, is the most fundamental part of us being healthy as human beings.
Absolutely. I agree. I know there's so many different places and contexts in which people can find safe and healthy and really co-regulating, grounded people to be able to help
Yes.
witness them through these painful experiences and be able to start letting some of that move through. I'm curious if you would share where you first found that type of support in your life.
Yeah, I remember moments from when I was very young. I think some of my relatives, I mentioned my family situation, my home immediate family was a very chaotic situation, but I think I had some aunts and uncles who had more capacity to be present and co-regulate. Um, I remember looking forward to certain family gatherings, like there was something in me that somehow understood that if I could just be around this person, somehow I would be better. Um, I as I was going through school, I think because of my sensitivity and all of the difficult environment I was in, I was suicidal early and I became very withdrawn and I'm very introverted anyway, so I was almost invisible. When I would go to school, I didn't want to interact with the other kids. I didn't want to. I found I was often bullied. I was small. I was prone to cry easily. Um, but I had some teachers who I think saw me and cared about me and just I think it was just simply their ways of being and the ways of talking with me. I think again, feeling seen, feeling cared for. Um, and then into my adulthood, I was having a lot of physical problems and I was starting to go to different healers to try and get help. I mean, and given my background and tradition, I had to start with the classical, I would say very conservative view of the world. But increasingly I would go to these different professionals and I wasn't getting any relief. And I eventually found myself in the presence of, um, he called himself a divine boxer. He was a healer, but in the Taoist tradition. Um, and I remember he was probably the first person that I felt I had actually been seen and fully accepted for who I was. Like the things that I experienced, if I would try and talk with most of the people in my life, they looked at me like I was crazy. Um, but he understood everything that I was experiencing, everything that I was talking about, and it didn't even, like, he didn't even flinch. For me, that was such a remarkable find, a remarkable encounter. And yeah, I think that was a very significant milestone. And I believe very, very likely that if I had not met him and not had the opportunity to interact with him intensively for a number of years, I wouldn't be here today.
Thanks for sharing that. I um I also know that you have some practices and traditions like spiritual traditions in your life, and I'm curious how those are weaved in as a part of your healing journey, or if maybe they parallel alongside of it. Um, but yeah, I wonder too if that opening that you just mentioned with that one really special person in your life you mentioned was in the Taoist tradition, if that was part of jump starting that for you.
I think it was, and probably even earlier. Somehow, I was raised not by my parents, but in the town that I live, some of our neighbors, I was raised in the Christian tradition. And so, being the way that I'm inclined to learn, to study, to be curious, I really dove in fully and was studying and reading and asking questions, probably annoyingly so to a lot of people. But one of the things I learned from reading the Bible early on was that there were these practices, fasting, meditation, giving. I also noticed that in the tradition that I was a part of at the time, most people didn't do those things. And I'm like, why? Like here they are, they're laid out, but why is it that we're not doing those things? And the answer was less than satisfactory. Like we do certain things, but not others. But I was somehow drawn to meditation. And so I remember as a teenager, I found a book on meditating and tried to teach myself how to meditate using a book. Somehow I had the sense that it would be helpful. I laugh now because one of the great realizations in trying to do that is that reading about, thinking about, meditating is not at all like meditating. And I didn't really learn how to meditate, what I would call meditate, until I could sit with someone who understood what meditation was. And so, yes, my encounter with that teacher, James was his name, teacher healer. He, and I had already gone through, like I said, a number of different healers unsuccessfully without being able to resolve my symptoms. And he said, yes, I will take you on. I will help you. I know that I can help you, but I'll only help you if you're willing to learn and take on practices. He said, because I can do what we do in session, and you might feel a little relief for a little while, but what you're experiencing is based on your whole life. And unless you can gradually start to change your life, how you're encountering each day, then what I can do is not going to last. And I was like, yes, at that point I was so desperate. I mean, I could barely turn my head. I couldn't feel half my left arm. I was in constant pain and I was not able to be present to people. So at that point I was like, I'll do whatever. Give me something. I'll do my best to do it. And so that's where I started to really appreciate the power of practice.
Mm.
Consciously dedicating some of our focus and our attention to understanding things differently, to having different experiences. This comes back to that connect, explore, adapt. Once I had the connection and had some confidence that this person had my best interest in mind and actually was demonstrating that they could help me, then I found myself more able to explore, to try the things that he was suggesting. And the adaptation happens on its own. But before that, I had this notion that I needed to adapt. Like I just had to get to it. I had to make myself better. But without the connection and without the exploration, I was continually frustrated in not being able to make any real progress.
Yeah. I love that you broke that down into those three sort of steps and this natural sort of flow, connection, exploration, adaptation. Yeah, that
Yeah.
that definitely kind of shows how when we kind of bypass or skip over some of the necessary ingredients, it's frustrating our ability to reach that end step.
Yeah, I mentioned my grandkids earlier. I want to emphasize this piece because I think if there's anything useful that I have to say, I think this recognition is perhaps the most useful. So I've gotten to be with my grandkids since they were babies. And as they were starting to speak, so when they reached the age that they started to speak, I was struck by one of the very first things they could say, and they would always do it with motion, is sit, sit. And what were they doing? They were asking us, me or grandma or mom or dad, whomever, sit. They recognized and wanted someone to come and be with them, I would say to bear witness with whatever they were doing. And then they would just completely ignore you. But what they were asking for, like one of their very first words, probably they had 10 words, this was one of them, was an invitation to be held, not physically held, but to be held in the contact of someone whom they loved, who they felt safe with.
Mm.
And then as their language continued to grow, what I noticed is when they felt safe, when mom was present or grandpa was present, they would automatically explore. They couldn't even walk yet. They're like crawling around and inevitably they would hurt themselves. They would bump into something or they would fall down and then they would be really hurt. And so one of the next things they learned, again, with very few words, was kiss it. They would come back to the source of the contact and they would, indicate where they were hurting and you could kiss it, and magically they're better and they're off to exploring again. And in that exploration, especially young children, they would do the same thing over and over. They would pour toys from one container into the next for sometimes a half an hour or more. And you could just watch them over the weeks, like their motor skills were getting better and better. They have this innate curiosity that empowered them to do this. But without the support of contact and without the source of comfort when their exploration led to pain, then it was interrupted. But when they had both, just this innate, just I don't even know how to, it's such a remarkable capacity of human beings to adapt.
Absolutely. And that secure base of connection and that source of comfort is so important, even if it's just for, like, as you mentioned, those little parts of the exploration, right? There was that invitation to sit, bunch of exploring, coming back for comfort, more
Yes.
exploring, probably more exploring happening than anything else. And that
Yes.
reminds me a little of what you're saying. It was like with your teacher, right? It's like
That's
I
right.
can I could be this base,
That's
right?
right.
And now you're going to do practices all week and come back and connect, practices all week, come back and connect.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. And so witnessing it with my grandkids recently, I came to recognize I haven't really changed that much from them. Like that's what I want more than anything. I want someone to come and sit with me. I want someone to bear witness to my living. And when I bump into things, because I will, we all do, and it hurts, we just want someone to help make it better. If we have that, everything else seems to take care of itself.
Mhm. Yeah, that's beautiful. I'm curious too if you'd like to say something. This might be skipping ahead quite a bit in the journey chronologically, but if you'd like to say something about when you're working with clients and being that base, right? So you had that experience with your teacher,
Yeah.
and now you offer that experience to others.
Yeah, the main thing I would say is I have studied and well, I have experienced the benefit from many different skilled practitioners and many different traditions. I have studied and practiced deeply in many different traditions, including coaching. I know that you and I share a background in learning integral coaching. Um, and I would say now when I work with people, and I probably should mention, um, I'm also trained in engineering. I have a PhD in engineering, which a lot of people find to be such an odd combination for how I talk about things. But all of it's true. All of it's true. And all of it has influenced the way that I think about things. So even now, I'm working with organizations in I'll call it very high level business model refinements. And I'm working with managers and I'm working to redesign systems and organizations. And I work with individuals to help them with their own, like, how do they live? One way to say it simply is, how can we reduce our suffering, experience less suffering, and experience more joy? Like all of that's true for me. The way I approach all of that work, I think, is it starts with this recognition that we all need connection. So perhaps the most useful thing that I can offer anyone, even though I can hear my mind right now saying, it's all the great distinctions that you have and your great intellectual understanding. And yeah, those are cool. Those can be really helpful. But I think the more important thing is that when someone is in my presence, they like who they are. I discovered this for myself early on. Like, and this can sound so obvious, but it took me a long time to learn it, is that based on how we've evolved, I think everything we experience in our life is getting evoked in us. It's getting evoked in us based on our biology, which is, you could trace it way, way back, our conditioning, which is lifelong, and our circumstances, where we find ourselves, what is happening around us. I had this misunderstanding early on that I should be able to do better. I should be able to do better and stay in the same environments that I had been in that had caused all the trauma in the first place. It turns out that if you're outside and it's really cold and you don't have a coat, telling yourself you should feel warmer doesn't work. It actually makes more sense to either get a coat and put it on or get inside where it's warm. So a big part of what I learned is, oh, if I'm going to honor this longing to be healthier, to be able to enjoy living more, it's really helpful to learn when I feel like that. Like when I feel joy, when I feel happier, when I feel more open. So one phrase that emerged to me is, oh, I like who I am in your presence. And then I could notice, ooh, I do not like who I am or how I show up in your presence or in this circumstance. So I think kind of as a culmination of all the things I've learned and what's happened in my own unfolding is I value what I can offer people more than anything is that they like who they are in my presence. I can somehow allow myself to show up in such a way that they feel safe, that they feel seen, that they feel accepted for who they are right now in the moment. Me recognizing that no matter what, you're doing the best you can with what you have access to in the moment. And even in a business context, that might not be good enough to actually fulfill the role that you've taken on. And we can name that, but we can also not blame you for that because what's happening is your best. That's your best you've got in that moment. So to be with someone, to be able to say, yes, you have this intention, and this is how you're acting, this is how you're behaving, this is what you've been able to bring about so far. That's true, and maybe it's falling short of what you're wanting. And here we are. Like it's okay.
I love the way that you describe that, and I couldn't help but also be picturing, your grandchildren learning their new skills alongside that explanation with the adult clients you're mentioning, right? And it's no different. Like we're still up to the same things, right? So maybe the skill
I
is
think so.
learning how to self-regulate and um, maybe that's a interpersonal and personal skill somebody's involved with, and it's the same as your grandchildren learning how to pour from one to the other, right? Like, what does it take? It takes practice, takes
Takes
connection,
practice, takes
takes
connection,
exploration.
comfort when we fail and it hurts.
Yeah.
And you used the word earlier. I like this word a lot. I think co-regulation.
Mhm.
As a human being in our early years, but I think it's true for most of us. In some circumstance, we will find ourselves, any of us, all of us can find ourselves in certain circumstances where our emotions are beyond our ability to self-regulate. And it can be disruptive. It can actually paralyze us or cause us to break down, or there are many ways we can talk about it, but we cease to become functioning, which is such an important part of our culture. Like but when we can be with someone who helps us regulate, again, we're social creatures. We have evolved to be social creatures. We are not designed to be solo in the world. So yes, I think, in fact, my teacher James, his name was Kapp, James Kapp, he told me early on, because at the time, I was still treating my life as a problem to be solved, and I was trying to figure out what to do. I didn't like my work. I didn't like who I was. I didn't like how I felt. I didn't like most things. Um, he said to me, it's so amazing. This was years and years ago. I still hear him say, what if your job was to always bring calm confidence into a room? Being the smart ass that I was at the time, I'm like, well, nobody's going to pay me for that. Well, it turns out all my clients are paying me for that. I have learned I'm not bringing a calm confidence into the room because it's already always available. But I have learned ways for some people to help them recognize more of what's true about themselves and their environment, such that they experience their own innate calm, stillness, confidence, having the ability to help people recognize more of what's true in this way about themselves and each other, I think is in fact one of the most valuable contributions I can make.
I'm curious also if you could share with us maybe a little bit of reflection of how your experience of the world has maybe shifted from, say, 40 years ago to today? Not that those are necessarily starting and end points of your life, but just over a period of time on a healing journey. And also
Yeah.
maybe your view of yourself.
Yeah. Thank you. I think for much of my early years and, from my early childhood and into my early adulthood, I experienced the world as being a dangerous, hostile place. I expected to be hurt. I expected things to go wrong. I expected to mess up. I expected to be punished. I expected things to be bad. Now, I find the world to be so fascinating, so interesting. And yes, there's so much pain. There's still so much pain, not just for me, but there's so much difficulty of what's happening. But I think a part of why I expected it and it felt it to be a hostile place is I was still under the impression that there was good and bad, that there was right and wrong, that if I wanted to feel better, that I had to rise above it all, that I had to somehow find a way to escape the messy aspects of my humanity. And I tried hard for decades to do that. Like I'm like, my teacher was like, you have to do, yeah, I'll do it. I'll do it. There's something in me that's like, I can drive myself like a beast of burden to do something that I think is important. And what I've come to discover is that life has all of it all the time. Like I used to feel that I was always angry or I was always sad or I was always whatever. Like I would experience an emotion as if it was some monolithic thing. And now I feel my emotion kind of like a really interesting food. There's this whole array of sensations and flavors and aromas, and they're unfolding in different concentrations over time, but there's never just a single note, ever. So as I've been able to access more of my innate flexibility, elasticity, what I notice is it isn't that I stopped feeling pain and started feeling joy. It's that if I'm going to feel joy, or even let's be bold and say bliss, that I'm also going to feel pain in a way that way beyond what I felt before. So one recognition that occurred to me just a few years ago is, again, my mind's always trying to solve things. And then I hear my mind saying, oh, bliss. Bliss is not the absence of pain. Bliss is recognizing that aspect of ourselves and resting into it that is not disturbed by pain. There is an aspect of ourself, we could call it the source of life, the source of being, that is still no matter what. One of the first practices I learned from James Kapp that he had me start to practice right away is called the Great Silence. Learning to hear the silence no matter what else is happening. To even, and I can hear his words now. The great silence. Every sound that we hear arises from the great silence, abides within the great silence, and returns to the great silence. No matter how loud the thoughts are in our head, or how loud the noises are outside, or how loud the voices are from other people telling us what's right or wrong about us, there is an aspect of ourself that is not disturbed by any of it. It's always been true. It's always been true about me. It's always been true about all of us. We don't have to make it be so. The difference is that I used to be fixated on the voice that told me I was wrong, I was bad, something needed to be fixed about me. And now, when I start to hear those words, because they still come up, I can recognize, oh, yes, that's true. That voice is true. That experience is true. The pain is true. And there is an aspect of me where the stillness is never disturbed. That's also true. When I recognize that about myself and all of us, that pain can move through the sky like the birds flying by. It's really no different.
Mm. wonder if you could speak a little bit to how that internal sense, like this always constant, always there, available part of you that is undisturbed by the pain that's around, how that might be related to that secure base connection. Because there something interconnected that you find is important about that?
I do think so. Yeah, I really appreciate that question. So when I use the words connect, explore, adapt, like we've evolved to connect, explore, and adapt, I think connection can happen in many different ways. The felt experience of being connected. Another way to say it is uh, that metaphor, that desperation that I had for so long of needing to find and solve the problem, or else I was going to be left for all eternity and there would be literal hell to pay. The other word that would come to mind, having grown up in the South, was this notion that you could fall off the truck. You'd be on, sack of potatoes thrown up on the truck. The truck's going to market over the bumpy road. You fall off the truck. You're not going to make it to market. I had that experience for so long. And then once I started to recognize this aspect of us, I started to actually recognize, oh, it isn't even possible to fall off the truck. I am the truck. This aspect of us is the very source of it all. I don't even have to find it because I've never been outside of it. It isn't even possible to be outside of it. That is a very profound experience of connection and contact. But for most of us, we don't have access to that initially on our own. And the way we start to recognize this truth about ourselves is through the felt experience of contact with another from our earliest days. So for those of us who've been fortunate enough to be with caregivers who have the capacity to be present, who can help us co-regulate, we have a much smoother kind of introduction to this experience. But for those of us who didn't have that good fortune, it's still possible. Like I think for most of us, if we reflect back, even just to think about, what's one or two or three people in our life, even if they're not current, that we felt some sort of warmth and open-heartedness with, even if we can recall it right now, we can feel it in ourselves. That feeling of open-heartedness and warmth, innate tenderness, it's already always there. We've just been conditioned to not recognize it. So, as I mentioned before, I can feel it with people. I feel it with my grandkids in particular ways because they're so open, so curious, so affectionate. But I can also feel it hiking, especially for me when I'm in trees and I hear the birds and see the birds. These are like ways of being in contact that remind me of something else that's so much bigger than what I'm prone to fixate on. And so with practice, with recognition, with support, then we can, I think, stabilize our recognition of this experience, this aspect of ourself, so that we still need human contact. I still long for and need human contact. I still long for and need contact with nature, as if we could ever be outside of nature. I still feel and long for this, I'll call it non-conceptual recognition of that which can never be disturbed. All of that are different ways of experiencing contact.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I know you mentioned being in contact with another person being a very important starting step in that, whether that's in the young childhood or in adulthood, starting a healing journey.
Yes.
And then also the practices. There's the one you mentioned about the great silence. I'm curious if there were other practices along the way that were in your own journey that helped you get to the point where you could access that.
Yes, many, many. Again, my personality is such that I'm a voracious learner, dogged, voracious learner. So I have explored and studied many traditions and worked with many talented people. So I would say my early therapy, I went through decades of intensive therapy, and there are many different models. As you know, there are many different models in the psychological way of understanding ourselves and human well-being. And I think learning different ways of reframing, different ways of understanding, different ways of making sense of our experience, that can be really, really helpful. And, if we had more time, I could articulate a number of different, I'll call them big realizations that have really stuck with me and I think served me well. I think because I'm prone to be drawn to intellectual ways of making sense of things, those really have their limits. They're very powerful and I think had tremendous benefit for me. And they're not enough by themselves because one of the misunderstandings I had early on was that I held my beliefs in my mind. And at some point I came to recognize, oh no, my beliefs are embodied. Like I started to appreciate at some point, my body isn't just a faulty, easy to blame transport system for my beautiful mind. No, they're not separable. In fact, anything I believe is being held, including my identity. How I know myself, who I hold myself to be, is a literal holding in my physical tissue as well. So fortunately, when I encountered James, he was a body worker and used many different methods, but he was also a Qigong and a Tai Chi teacher. And so I started to learn Qigong, which I found to be really resonant. And so I've been fortunate to study with several different Qigong masters over my life. I find that way of making sense of things and practicing to be very supportive, opening, just layers upon layers of opening, releasing those fixations and constrictions so that my system is more elastic, more able to feel the range of human emotion, to respond with less effort to whatever's unfolding. And then I also feel very fortunate, and James introduced me to a tradition called Dzogchen. Dzogchen comes out of the Tibetan traditions, and I have, again, had the good fortune of studying with several lamas and rinpoches in those traditions. A core aspect of Dzogchen is that we are already innately whole, that we don't need to transform ourselves. We don't need, and it isn't even possible to earn freedom. The whole set of practices is largely, in my understanding and in my experience, is largely around helping us recognize where we're confused, where we're bound up, and gently, gently, gently relaxing those constrictions and fixations so that there's a metaphor that I came across in a Zen teaching, which is a free mind is like tossing a ball in a stream, and the ball never gets caught on anything. It can continually just move freely as the river flows, as the stream flows, as compared to if it gets caught against a stick and then it feels the force of the water flowing by, forcing it under, right? That's a very different experience of life. So this notion of, and it can come through meditation, it can come through, some will call it transmission, which again, for me, is just another way of being in the presence of someone who recognizes this about themselves and about the people around them. It helps us remember more of what's true.
That's beautiful.
And this distinction between conceptual and non-conceptual is really important. One of my primary teachers in the Dzogchen tradition he emphasizes the importance of non-conceptual awareness, what he often calls naked awareness. What it's like to experience noticing before the concepts. Like this experience of stillness that cannot be disturbed, it's not a concept. It becomes a concept when we name it because our language is always conceptual, but the experience is something rich and full before and that cannot be fully contained in the words. The other thing that he really emphasized that was huge for me, I did a number of years of training with him. He would say so often, just rest. Just rest. What I came to recognize is that, there's so many practices in all these traditions, and some of them are quite challenging. My some things would say, you're not doing enough, you're not working hard enough, you can't do it, you blah, 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 blah. And then one day I recognized, oh, that which brought me to these practices wasn't me consciously. I didn't even know them. I didn't know about them. That which brought me to these practices has already always been working on my behalf and will continue to do so even without my effortful narrator. So again, it's like, oh, I can't fall off the truck. Like it isn't even possible. As our system is able to genuinely rest when it's appropriate to rest, then our ability to respond and exert becomes more effective as well.
Yeah. Even as you said that right now, bringing that back. Oh, that's right. I can't fall off the truck. It isn't even
Yeah,
possible. I could
yeah,
feel just even hearing you say that again, like the rest in my own nervous system. I'm
yeah.
curious, how does it feel for you to really step into that knowing? Like somatically, maybe, how does that feel for you?
I'm still prone to feel a lot of constriction. I think I've been so conditioned. And because I am so sensitive, I feel so many things. I'm still prone to constriction. My body is prone to constriction. If I can remember, I've also learned methods from someone like Judith Blackstone, who has developed the realization process. She has the psychological background, and she also has a lot of deep experience in some of these spiritual traditions and has developed her own methodology. Um, there are ways to remind us that, for instance, we can experience, and maybe you can even try it for yourself, we can experience space within ourselves. Oftentimes early on, I felt myself like I was a series of layers of rocks that had been put around my tender, raw heart to try and keep me alive. But it's hard to move in the world when you're like, layers of rocks. To experience myself, feel an experience of spaciousness in my body, that's a really cool experience. But if I'm still contracting around my skin or my edges, which I am prone to do, it can feel a little bit like being a balloon. And then when something big arises, like emotion, fear, anger, longing, it can feel a lot of pressure. Judith uses a phrase, notice that the space inside your body and the space outside your body is the same continuous space. It pervades you and the room. Like even as I say that, I can feel how the tendency to hold the energy of our life emerging, and it can be quite uncomfortable, it somehow relaxes. And then you can notice that, oh, that boundary that I so often feel, it's a true experience, but there's so much more that's also true. Even from a classical physics and quantum physics point of view, there is no hard surface here. There is no hard boundary here. And even if we notice the skin itself as a tangible physical thing, there's constant exchange across it. To feel that undivided continuum helps my whole system settle. I'll go back to a simple way of saying it for me is that early on, my misunderstanding was in order to feel okay, I had to rise above my human messiness because I felt myself as being a total mess. Another big shift for me through this journey has been, oh, I'm never going to not be a mess. In fact, most days I feel like I'm ill-equipped to even be in this world. I'm never going to not be a mess. I'm always going to be a mess. Sometimes I'm a dreary mess, and sometimes I'm a funner mess. If I could just be a funner mess, like that would be something that I'd be really happy about. So when I can remember this stillness and feel it, not just remember it, but feel it, come back to it, when I can recognize this unbounded spaciousness, then there's room for my messiness to thrive. Yeah.
I love how you describe the spaciousness inside and outside as being a continuum. And I'm curious, since you mentioned the importance of nature a few times, if there's ways of practicing with that literally outside of nature that you feel you can
Yes.
feel that in a certain way. Yeah, would you give an example?
Yeah, they're really simple ones and then some bigger ones. But one of the ones I noticed early on is, again, because my mind is prone to kind of start to cycle in on these tight ways of thinking, and I'll be out walking. And what I'll notice is that I'm looking, down at the ground a few feet in front of me. And I can feel the constriction happening even as I'm telling myself I should be exercising. I learned that if I could simply adjust my gaze, instead of looking at the ground in front of me, just shift my gaze to look out forward, I would start to feel more space. And then, let's not get crazy here, but if you want to take a chance, just take a pause and actually look up into the sky. And there's a practice that happens in these Eastern traditions actually called sky gazing, where you turn and you look into the boundless openness of the sky. Even just describing it now, I can't see the sky from where I'm sitting, but just describing it and turning my head this way, I can feel it. We are never, just like I can say we can never fall off the truck, we are never outside of nature. There is nothing about us that isn't natural. Even all the things that we would say humans have done wrong, I came to recognize, oh, but even that is just nature itself unfolding. We can never stand outside of nature. For me, water is also very, very restorative. And as I mentioned before, trees. So I'll share this story. It, yeah, I'll share this. A few years ago, I was having a very difficult time. Something in me was wanting me to die. It was quite convinced that that was my only real option. And it was actively planning for ways to make it happen. So I'm out hiking in one of my favorite parks near where we live here in Minnesota. And it's trying out all these scenarios of how it would kill myself and maybe in the park. And I could hear the arguments that were happening, and something was like, no, you couldn't do that because what if a child found you? And no, you couldn't do that because you wouldn't want to cause harm. And then, but it's still this kind of intensive pressure. And then at some point, I'm being with my somethings and I hear you. Like that seems like the only thing to do. And I completely get that that makes sense. Like that, I get it. Like I really get it. And have you noticed that as you've been walking here on the trail, you've been carefully avoiding the ants so as not to step on them? That's also true. Like being in the presence of life unfolding in all of its myriad forms helps us to recognize that whatever experience we're having is just a small piece of it. And I think just being more, I would say, in less filtered contact, like sitting in this room where I am in my house right now, I don't have that same raw encounter of the trees and the ants and the butterflies and right? So the more we can, as a practice, get ourselves outside to feel the warmth of the sun on our skin, to feel the cooling aspect of the breeze, to smell the aromas of the wet soil. They're all powerful reminders of more of what's true. And uh, again, for me, I'm at the place where whatever's happening is absolutely fine. Like when something in me thinks I need to die, that's the most appropriate thing. For me, that's welcome. It's welcome. And even like I think I shared this with you before, but I now am at the place in my life where I'm like, oh, I fell awake again this morning. I wonder what's going to happen today. I don't have a sense that I need to solve my life. I don't have a sense that it's going to turn out any particular way. I'm just grateful to have the opportunity to be curious about what's happening, to feel the embrace of my grandchildren. It's enough. It's enough.
I'm also noticing as you share that you've really internalized the way of being with yourself and parts of yourself that was modeled for you when you first felt seen and heard and welcomed and understood, and that you're able to
Yes.
bring that to yourself now.
Yes. And again, I don't think it's anything I did. I think this is an innate capacity that we all have that through our biology, conditioning, and circumstances, we've lost touch with.
Yeah. And I can see that that connection and is a path back to being in touch with it, right?
Yeah, that's right. I think, again, when we can feel connection, whether it be another human being, which for most of us, I think in our early parts of our journey, that's likely where we're going to need it.
Mhm.
But any sense, felt experience of real connection, of empathetic, accepting connection, the rest of it happens on its own. Dzogchen has a phrase that we can often misunderstand, and it you can hear it in different ways, but the way I heard it so often was allow things to be just as they are. Allow things to be just as they are. Now, the trick with that, and I don't even know if that's what the person said, but that's what I always heard, is there was something in me that heard that as an assignment, that I had to try to allow things to be just as they are. And that's hard. In fact, when I tried to allow things to be just as they are, I would find myself constricting more. And then it was like kind of like my realization of bliss. Oh, bliss is not the absence of pain. Bliss is recognizing that and resting into that which is not disturbed by pain. It was like, oh, actually, they're not telling me to try to allow things to be as they are. What they're pointing to is that when I recognize this already always present aspect of me and all of us, I will find myself able to allow things to be just as they
Mm.
are. And when I find myself able to allow things to be just as they are, it includes everything, including if I'm standing outside and it's really cold and I don't have a coat. And that's something in me that says, get your ass inside. That's part of what's also true. It's all part of what's true. And there is an aspect of me that's already, always allowing everything to be just as it is.
I think the last question I have for you today is, we've been talking about a journey that spans many decades and that has been unfolding over time, as you've been mentioning. So I'm curious, what's unfolding for you now at this moment in your life? Maybe what feels like is really up and present for you in this journey, or what practices are supporting you in this journey? What are you up to in the present moment today?
Yeah. Again, thank you for that question. I think perhaps more than ever before in my life has gotten to be quite simple. I still do a lot of complicated things, but there are a few slogans have emerged for me. Um, One of them I've already kind of said in different ways today, but may we each discover more of what's true in ways that benefit me and you. May we each discover more of what's true in ways that benefit me and you. I find myself constantly turning with this intention, with this invocation, that in whatever context I'm in, that I find myself able to open more and more to what's true in a way that's beneficial for me and for the people around me or for the environment around me. Another slogan that's emerged is, may we each find ourselves participating more playfully in a creative unfolding of life. May we each find ourselves participating more playfully in a creative unfolding of life. One of the things I've noticed is that life is going to unfold creatively, whether I'm having fun with it or not. If I can find myself doing it more playfully, I'm going to have a better time of it. And then, probably most simply and most recently, the slogan that's come to me is, may we each become comfortable enough in our own skins, I would say in our messy skins, so that we can enjoy living. Because for me right now, I don't know that there's anything more important than enjoying this breath, this conversation, this contact, this, messy toddler hand hug, right? all of my grand schemes and plans for what my life would be like, I've been reduced to recognizing that there's nothing more and nothing less than what's unfolding in this moment.
Thank you so much for being a guest with us today. I feel really touched and honored to have been able to be with you here and hear your story. And thank you so much for sharing it with our community.
Thank you. And thank you again for inviting me. I feel really honored. And I hope that at least some of your listeners heard something that sparks this recognition of what's true in them.